All right, we're good to go here. So as I said, we are going to be recording this webinar for today's purposes. I'm Annabelle Escamilla, Assistant Director of IHEC. Got with us today, we got Jennifer Jacobsen, who is over at McAllister College, worked with us before with IHEC for many years now. Glad to have her back. Give some insight and some tips that may sound simple, but are very applicable and practical for using AOD data to really benefit our prevention programming and to have that evidence-based drive for our work. So I will turn it over here to Jen in a minute, but just a few housekeeping notes. I'll be managing the chat here, so if you do have questions, throw them in there. You can either put them directly to me out there. We will manage that as we go. And since it is a low populated webinar, Michelle, feel free, you can always unmute, ask questions as you need to. I will be sending out the slide deck and then posting it with the Zoom recording on our YouTube channel as well. So people can send it to their colleagues, watch later, review for their own needs. So, all right, Jen, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Annabelle. And thanks, folks for being here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about simple strategies to support your alcohol and other drug efforts with data. As Annabelle mentioned, I'm at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, but I lived the longest portion of my life in Illinois. I was born and raised there, so always excited to partner with folks in the state of Illinois. I want to start out by thanking both the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Other Drug and Violence Prevention, but also Annabelle for inviting me back, all the great work that Eric Davidson, the director, does to support this work. And then for you for making time on a Thursday in April in higher education, because we know the end of the semester, the end of the term, whatever schedule you are on is coming fast. So in the chat, you could share your name and your role and institution. And Michelle, we've heard from you, so I don't think you need to put that in the chat. But I am curious, I mentioned April in higher ed. On the squirrel scale, which is both valid and reliable, what number squirrel are you feeling today?
I'm going to go with 5.
So the no more. How about you, Annabelle? Which squirrel are you today?
Solid 8. Like, whoa, hold on. We got stuff to do. Slow down.
Yes, I know. I'm feeling 9, which is sort of in the same genre. But I know in higher ed in the Midwest, we're very attached to the squirrels on our campus. So what we said we do, right? I always like to revisit the learning outcomes. We said after this session, you might be better able to identify potential existing alcohol and other drug data sources, develop new strategies for collecting alcohol and other drug related data that don't require data expertise. And 3, devise strategies for sharing alcohol and other drug data in effective and engaging ways. So first, some data fun. Is I've pulled some data related to alcohol and other drugs from the American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment 3. This was done in spring 2024. I used the undergraduate reference group data, which is just shy of 80,000 students. And I also want to note, this is a data source that's publicly available to you. So even if you don't have campus level survey data, we do have national data available that you might be able to use on your campus for advocating for the value of your work. But I'm curious, what percentage of students self-reported they felt their health and well-being is a priority of their college and university? You can either put that in the chat or unmute and share out. What do you think, Michelle?
I don't know. I think that for our small institution, we have some resources here on campus. And we have a great benefits navigator here who does a really good job with them. I would say that we have a high percentage that would feel like they are a priority, that their that their health and mental health and well-being is a priority here.
Oh, great. What do you think, Annabelle? Oh, Annabelle might
I
have
was
stepped away.
thinking priority of the college. I misread it first. Ooh, I was gonna say maybe 40.
Yeah, the answer is 83%.
Wow.
And I think that speaks a lot to our work because sometimes, right, folks who are doing work related to alcohol and other drugs are the most visible in this way. What percentage of students self-report that over the past 3 months they have felt a strong desire to use tobacco or nicotine delivery products? And the survey lays all these options out there: cigarettes, e-cigarettes, Juul or other vape products, water pipe or hookah, chewing tobacco, cigars, etc. What percentage of all undergraduates do you think self-reported they felt that strong urge?
65.
Ooh, what do you think, Michelle?
I would say 42.
All right, the answer is
Wow.
14%. I will say nationally, about 20% of students are self-reporting use in the last 3 months. That's up from 3 years ago when it was closer to 7%. So it's one of those things for us to keep an eye on that we thought maybe we had could take our foot off the gas because usage rates dropped, and actually they have started to increase quite a bit. What percentage of students self-report over the last 2 weeks they had 5 or more drinks in one sitting if they identify as male, 4 or more drinks in one sitting if they identify as female? And that meets what we usually think of as the baseline for binge drinking.
32.
What do you think, Annabelle?
Mm, probably 27.
All right, 21.4, so lower than you might have thought, but that is still 1 in 5 of our students self-reporting
Right.
binge drinking at least once in the last 2 weeks. Some of them report more than that. So that's letting us think a little bit about intensity of use. What percentage of students self-report any cannabis, marijuana use in the last 30 days? What do you all think?
I would say it's probably about the same as the drinking. And
Yeah,
maybe
about 24.
since it is a legal
Look
drug.
at that, Michelle. You're right on. And Annabelle, you
Wow.
were close. So about 1 in 5 of our students self-report any cannabis or marijuana use in the last 30 days. We might worry about those 5.6% who self-report use daily or almost daily. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute. Minnesota, like Illinois, is a state where adult use cannabis is legal, but we'll talk about some of those concerns in a second. In their life, what percentage of students self-report? So this is not the last 3 months, it's ever in their life. What percentage of students self-report having ever used prescription opioids? And they give the whole list there. And they're asked to report non-medical use only. And as a responsible instrument, the survey explains that non-medical use means taking prescription drugs just for the feeling or experience, or taking them more often or at higher doses than prescribed. So in their life, what percentage of our students are self-reporting non-medical opioid prescription drug use?
Probably
Yes.
5 to 8%.
You say 5 to 8. What do you think, Michelle?
I'm gonna say it's about the 20%.
It is 2.9%.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and now this isn't counting, right, sort of illicit opioid use, but this is the misusing prescription opioids. And I just share this out because if your campus is like our campus, there is a lot of very healthy interest in naloxone training, having Narcan, which is the brand name, available for opioid reversals, thinking about when things are laced with fentanyl and that. And we often use our usage data on our campus to say, hey, yep, it's important because the stakes are high. And on our campus, we're actually more likely to run into a student who's experienced an alcohol overdose. So if we're going to do overdose training, let's do opioids and alcohol, because alcohol is actually going to be more common. So identifying some potential existing alcohol and other drug data sources. I sort of love this. Who wants stats? And everyone's raising their hand. Who wants to collect data? And everyone's looking down. It's a lot of work to collect data. So we're going to talk a little bit about where you might find existing sources of data and also thinking sort of creatively about data. Those of us who work in a college health center might be really familiar with the American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment. It could be that's run on your campus every 2, 3, 4 years. You might find that that data exists. If not, you can always use the national data to talk about trends nationally. Some campuses are using the Healthy Mind Survey, especially if you might be a JED campus with that 4-year commitment. They have you do a Healthy Mind Survey. It's out of the University of Michigan. In the first year and in the 4th year, there's substance use questions on there. You might have campus climate surveys. You might have student success surveys. If you, like us, have students take an online module before coming to campus, there are often, if it's an alcohol and other drug education module, there will often be questions for them, not just about their learning in their module, but their self-reported use. Some of those modules have a follow-up module 45 days later where they also survey on use. And you can kind of look to see on your campus, are students experiencing the college effect, that increase in drinking alcohol or using other drugs that's often predicted? I have found it interesting to look in the past, the college effect, while more students are self-reporting use 2 or 3 months into college, it's not as big of an effect as maybe the scripts we have around coming to college might indicate. On your campus, if someone's doing brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students or motivational interviewing sessions for other drugs or conduct sessions, on one of my campuses, we were using the Maxient software. And I asked just for a little bit of anonymous self-reported data of who called for help. Was this a first time drinking? Was it hard alcohol or beer or something else that actually gave us, in a really simple way, some data trends of our students who, let's say, were using alcohol in a way that it came to the attention of residential life or campus safety. What kind of patterns could we see in that? And that helped us advocate for prevention. Thinking about what data other campus partners have, and then any other sources of data. Annabelle and Michelle, I don't know if you have any thoughts at the top of your mind of if there's other sources of data that you've used on your campuses. All right, I can keep us rolling. Convenience data can also be effective data for social norming, but also to get a sense of trends on your campus. So this is an example of what we've integrated into the active bystander sessions we do with every one of our varsity teams, which is part of the NCAA Board of Governors requirement. And then we do this with our club sports teams is we like asking after we're debriefing a scenario involving alcohol use. If a teammate were worried about my alcohol use, I would want them to check in, and they click in real time. We happen to be using Poll Everywhere. You can use any number of things. And then this is the amalgam of all our fall sports teams down here that we actually use to show our coaches to advocate for why it's important we're doing alcohol and other drug education with their teams as part of our active bystander training. But it's really powerful in real time for students to see those norms of, oh, my teammates want someone to check in. It helps lower that barrier to checking in. But then we have historical data year over year to see what students are thinking. Another question we might ask of student athletes is, I want my teammates to think about the time of the season we're in when they're making decisions about alcohol and other drugs. And that's really powerful norming there. But also then we keep that data historically and see how things change year to year over the course of time. There's lots of situations in which you can use that kind of software. And again, if you're doing social norms work on campus, make sure you're really confident that the answer that's going to come up is going to be pro-social. But hang on to that historical data. And this is an easy data source that's really different than going through a process of doing a campus-wide survey, going through the IRB, having more data analysis. I also often encourage people to think about how they might develop new strategies for collecting alcohol and other drug-related data that don't require data expertise. I love this meme because I'm always forever fighting with Excel, but that you don't have to be a stats person to analyze data. So starting with that, right? Let's say you're on your campus, you find out you have NCHA data. You actually have a really nice descriptive data set that you can use for a lot of norms, but you might want to do some further analysis of data. I love that survey instrument and I'm really familiar with it. And I'm really challenged by trying to use SPSS statistical software. So ways I've partnered to help analyze data are student partnerships. We have a data science major here. I've gone to those folks, our math stats folks, and say, hey, I can give you part of this data set. If your students are looking for a real data set that's going to have a real outcome for some of their projects. Developmentally appropriately, there's nothing more interesting to our students than data about themselves. Work study students are our institutional research office always has some work study students, and they're often looking for kind of chunked projects. And so I can go there with our data set and say, hey, I have a couple questions here. Can your student investigate it? Or more interestingly, sometimes I say, here's the data set. I'm curious what your students find interesting, because I always have an idea how I want to interrogate the data, but students will bring new perspective to the table. Internships, I've had students do a public health internship on our campus who had some data skills. So thinking about ways we can partner with students. Community partnerships, there may be community-based organizations doing similar work. I've been collaborating. I'm fortunate here to be 5 miles from the University of Minnesota in their School of Public Health. And they have a cannabis research center. And so working with them a little bit on what that could look like. Faculty partnerships, right? So I've worked with faculty that they might have course assignments, our health psychology class. We have students work with different segments of some of our data to come up with a social norms campaign or another type of intervention. There might be researchers who can analyze existing data sets. I'm partnered with an associate dean from my former institution who got very interested in college students and sleep. And we work together analyzing a lot of data on what that can look like. And we've presented both at the NASPA Strategies Conference, but also most recently at the American Association of Colleges and Universities Conference on Learning and Student Success. And so that's a partnership where I'm getting some things analyzed. She's getting some really good professional work and presentation done, and it's mutually beneficial. And then you may have an institutional research and assessment office. I know depending on what campus you're on, they might have different capacities. We're really fortunate here at Macalester of our excellent partnership with that institutional research office. But one of the reasons I think our partnership is good is that I'm always showing them how we are using the data they helped us analyze. Like they're not just analyzing it, and then I'm looking at it and it's in a metaphorical drawer. I make sure they see how I'm using it at faculty workshops, how I'm using it at a student affairs workshop, how we're using it in a grant application. I also think that data person in your office, you might just have someone in your work experience, your work life, who's really good at data, who is just willing to do it because they're kind of nerdy about data. But I also think about the fact that not everything has to be a survey. I love this pie chart for exactly that reason. But thinking about some of our needs, I've worked with students and other colleagues before to think about what kinds of things we can do that aren't a survey. One of my favorite things I had an undergraduate public health intern do for us was actually an environmental scan. And one of the things she did, I was working at a campus that was very invested in recycling. This is fondly called the can because it's the can garbage or the recycling can for cans. And she for a semester would go and take pictures of the can in residence hall floors on Monday mornings before it got picked up. And it was a really interesting visual. As you can imagine, it made for a really interesting share out where it was one way we were really visually and sort of tangibly looking at trends of what weekends seemed to generate more recycling on campus, which weekends tended to generate less. Did it differ from part of campus to part of campus? If you're on a large campus, you don't have to do this on every floor. But it would be really interesting to do this on a floor with a lot of first-year students versus maybe a floor that's more diverse by class year. But this worked out really well for us, and people were really interested in engaging with this project. Another project we did was interviewing our facilities staff who is in charge of cleaning the common spaces on the first floors of our residence halls. Actually, and if you look really closely at this picture in the back right, you can see the can. But who were cleaning the lounge spaces and the public bathroom spaces on that first floor. And what that was like on Mondays and tracking that through the year. And what was really interesting about that was it was interesting for us to see how that matched with the recycling data, but also our facility staff, number one, made a lot of observations about things they noticed about our students and our students' behavior, right? Because they're actually in our student living spaces pretty regularly. But also we learned that cleaning up these residence hall common spaces on Mondays was a source of job dissatisfaction for facilities folks. And one of the reasons we weren't retaining them as much as we would like to. And that became an interesting conversation between residential life and the leadership of our facilities, but also being on a campus that valued social justice. It was really interesting to make our students more aware from these interviews of the impact their behavior was having on people who worked at the college and people with some of the least power and privilege on our campus. So that is to say, not everything has to be numbers or data or fancy or subject to analysis in a really typical way. There's things, especially when you talk to students on your campus, of ways of knowing you might find some other things. We had a partnership with an anthropology professor. There was a date of an all-campus party that was traditional over the course of a decade on campus. And actually, the anthropology professor trained her students to go out and walk across campus the day after the party and record what they saw, record what they could know, and use actually those anthropological skills, which I thought was really interesting. Another partnership that wasn't survey data is one of my colleagues in residential life and I. Now remember, this was a small campus, but we looked back on 2 years of on-call data of when was the hall director called, what kinds of things were happening, and one of the real things we were tracking at that time in between 2010 and 2018 was what was the substance at hand? Was it alcohol? Was it cannabis? And if it was alcohol, was it hard alcohol or was it beer? Because it tended to be one of those two things. And we learned in the course of 2 years, less than 2% of the calls were for beer and everything else alcohol-wise was hard alcohol. That's a lot of information for us, both in prevention and policy, and how should we be working so hard to keep beer from campus? And how do we need to focus on our students' hard alcohol use? So that was really useful. The thing I always want to caution when we're thinking about on-call logs is that your number of alcohol overconsumption transportation or transports to an emergency room is a tricky number to use to measure anything. At the same college, once we started doing active bystander training, from one semester to the next, we saw a 5-fold increase in the number of calls for an alcohol transport. And, someone on our senior leadership team said, what's going on campus that there's so much more drinking? And I was really fortunate to have a really good vice president of student affairs who said, we don't know what it's measuring, if it's more drinking or more calls for help. And absolutely, we want there to be more calls for help. But the way it tracked with the active bystander training, it was really interesting. So on-call logs can be a source of information, but I want folks to always use caution to think about what it might be measuring. But I'm curious oh, we lost Michelle. I'm curious, Annabelle, in your work, have you heard other creative approaches of how people are gathering information?
I would say the environmental scans are a big thing, or doing like the shoulder taps with law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think otherwise. I think sometimes it'd be surveys in the residential halls as well. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
it's more passive, but just trying to see like would students feel more comfortable taking a brief survey rather than being upfront about what they're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's lots of ways people do environmental scams, right? Like what advertising is up promoting alcohol in spaces where students go. And I think that's a really interesting policy piece as well. Moving on, thinking about devising strategies for sharing alcohol and other data in effective, engaging ways. I always feel like this is me, this is Leslie Nope from Parks and Rec. All I have on my side is facts and science, and people hate facts and science. And I say that because I get really excited about our alcohol and other drug data on our campus. And I always have to remind myself, other people don't get excited about it in the same way. And we need to think about clever ways that we can package it and put it where it needs to be in front of people. So I always think about, right, leveraging data. We want to think about as prevention specialists or whatever our role is, how we can share our story and value to higher education. And so we have learned, right, like we know that alcohol and cannabis and other drugs are still challenges for students on our college campus, but we know over time the focus of our senior leadership team, where they see the risk being, what they're worried about, has changed, right? So we know in 2012, when the Dear Colleague letter came for Title IX, and again in 2017 with Me Too, there was a lot of focus on campuses related to sexual violence prevention. Or what's happening on your campus in that way. We know, right? So not only at the peak of COVID were we worried about an infectious disease, there was a lot more conversation about student mental health because people were noticing it more. So we can think about any number of things. Our campuses, right, are becoming more inclusive. We're welcoming more and more students with identified disabilities to our campuses. And that's a really interesting area to connect to. And then recently, right, many boards of trustees are starting to have more questions about student safety and risk management. The other things we can think about too we've been thinking about belonging on our campuses and the way that affects retention. So when we share our story around alcohol and other drugs, not everyone wants us to come and talk about alcohol and other drugs. Or when we come to a conversation, the conversation might not be around alcohol and other drugs, but it could be a topic we're able to connect with. So when we think about equity, when we work with our institutional research to disaggregate our data, we can see that some of our students are more impacted by substance use than other students. Male identified students are more likely to drink alcohol. They're more likely to drink more drinks of alcohol. There's any number of things related to that. We can see our trans and non-binary students more likely to self-report cannabis use and more likely to self-report a lot of cannabis use, right? Correlation is not causation, but it's interesting when we're thinking, and increasingly on our campuses, we might not want to shout the word equity, but it is a way for us to think about equity is that disaggregation of data, as long as we're avoiding deficit thinking. Campuses are all about talking about student success. I'll give examples in a minute about how talking about cannabis is part of the student success conversation. How talking about alcohol, other drugs, especially cannabis, is part of the mental health conversation. How it's part of this student safety risk management conversation, right? I've been fortunate that it's been years since I've been on a campus where we've had a student loss. It is rare on a college campus that a student loss doesn't also involve alcohol and other drugs, whether it's an intentional situation with the student or unintentional. Talked about disability resources and the ways we see a relationship, particularly with cannabis, show up with ADD, ADHD, depression and anxiety. And are there ways that our work can be more aligned so that we can help disability resources help students manage their ADD effectively and not unintentionally be undermining it with cannabis use. And then that sense of belonging, right? And a lot of our students have misperceived norms about the substance use on their campus. And if there's someone who's choosing not to use substances, not use a lot of substances, don't want to use them until they're of legal age, helping norm actually that most of our students are using as often as they might think or as intensely they might think might be helpful. Needs assessment and gaps, right? What are we missing? Advocating for resources. And I think if your campus is like our campus, we're actually not advocating for an increase of resources. We're advocating to keep our status quo. Budgets are flat. And so that means we're having to really prioritize what we choose. And some of our alcohol and other drug data we use to say why having health promotion is so important, why having the budget for health promotion is so important. Using it to demonstrate our good work. I want to go back here just for a second. The poster you see on the right, and again, this is tying in, we were doing some really great work with our athletics department at an institution I was working at, and I was in another place where they were talking about college-wide learning outcomes, and nobody related to athletics was invited to participate in talking about the college-wide learning outcomes. So we already had a student athlete survey going every year. I added the college-wide learning outcomes to that student survey, and actually it was right. So I was using an existing survey. I wasn't inventing something new, but I tied it to what the conversation was on campus, which was about these college-wide learning outcomes. This was the only place people were quantitatively surveying students. And then I made a poster series of how our students were tying these college-wide learning outcomes to their athletic experience, which was really kind of a cool project. I'm going to just go a little in depth here with cannabis. Again, Illinois, like Minnesota, a state where adult use cannabis 21 and over is legal. But not on our college campuses, accepting federal money. But we do see in states where it's been legalized an uptick of use. We have over 10 years of data looking at Washington State and Colorado to learn from. And again, this is something you might be really interested in your cannabis prevention and education efforts. Other people on your campus might not. If they're Gen X like me, they might be thinking back to their college days where the THC concentration, the active ingredient in cannabis, was only 3 to 4%, and now it's closer to 25%. Its factors different. So you might need to tie your prevention work about cannabis to other things that are priority conversations on your campus. This could include mental health. Again, anytime someone comes and talks to me about our center and wants to talk about mental health and should we add more counselors and this and that, I also always want to tie it to our prevention folks, our health promotion folks, because we know there is a correlation. Correlation is not causation between our students who use cannabis and mental health. That's especially depression and anxiety. Suicidality, cannabis, right? We don't know the mechanism, but a student who's experiencing suicide ideation, if they're also using cannabis, that increases the likelihood they're going to make an attempt. So cannabis prevention work is suicide prevention work. Other risk behaviors, driving under the influence. In the national data, there's about the same percentage of folks who may be driving under the influence of cannabis as are driving under the influence of alcohol. We're seeing in those states with early legalization that there's the traffic fatalities of driving under the influence of cannabis have rapidly caught up to those driving under the influence of alcohol. One of the most successful public health campaigns of the last 50 years, Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk. Public health hasn't caught up yet with the Friends Don't Let Friends Drive High. Interestingly, students who self-report any past 30-day cannabis use in the NCHA, twice as likely to also self-report binge drinking, but students who self-report binge drinking no more likely to self-report cannabis use. So there's something really interesting there. It's not an either or. It's not students are using cannabis or are using alcohol. It's our students who are using cannabis are more likely to use alcohol in an intense way. Also non-medical prescription stimulant use. The demand for disability resources. So I'm so glad we're so fortunate at McAllister to have a robust disability resources office. And we are not helping our students, say, who are navigating ADD, if our disability resource folks aren't trained in a little bit of motivational interviewing to also ask about cannabis use, since cannabis use is contraindicated for folks with ADD, ADHD, and folks who are taking medication for that. Academic success and retention. All of our campuses care about this. I would really recommend pointing you to the fantastic research of Amelia Aria, who's over at University of Maryland's Research Center for Young Adult Health and Development. My favorite slide of hers, and man, it's 10 years old now. I love showing it to parents. I love showing it to colleagues on campus. What you're looking at is they actually did a longitudinal study of over 1,000 college students. And the very bottom line is what percentage who self-report minimal or no cannabis use stop out from college, taking a semester or more off. Those that report minimal use, it's just under 25%. Those who self-report chronic or heavy use, it is actually about 41%. There's about a 16% difference there. If your campus is like ours, our students who stop out, take a semester or more off, they don't all come back, right? We don't eventually retain them all as part of our 6-year graduation rate. So as we're having these conversations about academic success and retention, again, correlation is not causation, but we should worry more about our students who are self-reporting chronic or heavy cannabis use and our ability to retain them until graduation. This is, again, when we talk about the National College Health Assessment, this was published last year in the American Journal of Health Promotion, where they looked at 33 health behaviors that are in the national survey data and correlated it with academic success. And so every behavior was related to academic success other than heroin use, which is kind of interesting. I think it's a small numbers problem because so few students self-report that. You would really need to have, in any case. But just the idea that there's a link between numerous health behaviors and academic performance. Stakeholders invested in college students' health and academics should engage in mutually beneficial strategies to safeguard students' current and future well-being success. So if you have someone over in academic affairs who is research-minded and you need to open up this conversation around substance use and the way it correlates with grades, and we can debate how much grades accurately reflect academic engagement, but it's the best proxy we have. And again, correlation is not causation, but this could be a really great place to start. Cannabis and federal law. So I mentioned, right, both Minnesota and Illinois, adult use is legal. And the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act says we must develop and implement a program to prevent the unlawful possession, use, or distribution of illicit drugs and alcohol by students and employees. If we want to continue to accept federal funding and not be fined, it's really important that we help our students and community understand that cannabis use is not federally legal on our campuses. Regardless of state laws, if any institution accepts federal money and grants and work studies, it must follow federal laws which prohibit the possession of cannabis and related products. The Drug Enforcement Agency also specifically names THC, Delta 8 THC, Delta 9 THC. These are called out by name by the DEA as being federally illegal on our campuses. And I bring this up because, right, if we know that 21% of the students on our campus have used cannabis in the last month, we want to think about where that use is happening, but also the risk that violating federal law is bringing to our college campuses right now. We've always messaged, right? I've always worked at colleges with a lot of student visa holders, right? Our international students who are studying here on a visa, and how extra critical it is that they are following federal law, because that's who issues their visa, and not thinking just about state law. And so that 1 in 5 number becomes more relevant, both how does that intersect with our international students, but thinking about our domestic students who might be hosting an off-campus event where cannabis is present, in the ways it might put our international students at risk. So thinking about that. The last thing too, I always think about, how do we tie the data we have to the things our key shareholders on campus care about? How do we collect data they care about to open up the conversation? One of the places where we talk about cannabis use is with athletics, because the research shows cannabis is an ergolytic performance de-enhancing drug, and it negatively impacts the cardiovascular system, anaerobic systems, recovery, memory, attention, neurological acuity, and sleep. Those things are also important for academics. But we included, right, in our already existing student athlete social norms survey, we asked folks, if you haven't used marijuana, we were using that term at that time, now we use cannabis in the last 30 days, what were your reasons? And then, right, we normed this out. I actually had a student athlete design this, and it's very much in his style. So the messaging was coming from other students. And this really normed reasons why people might choose not to use. And it also is great information for me as a prevention specialist and educator. I was like, wow, only half said their coaches' expectations. And then I was like, wow, I've never offered any education to our coaches. So how would our coaches know to set these expectations? I'll also share, as you've seen in my work here, part of our role is always health literacy, data literacy. I always tell our students, just like you should not accept candy from a stranger, you should not accept data from people who don't cite their sources. Citing our sources is really important. Options for sharing and disseminating data. So always thinking about who are your key stakeholders and collaborators, what media and other opportunities already exist. I learned this in a summer workshop from the Iowa Department of Public Health, is to think about our share outs as bites, snacks, or meals. And there's a time and a place for each of those, right? So one of our things we do on campus is the Wheel of Norms, which is bite-sized, right? You spin the wheel. Somehow college students are just so attracted to the colorful wheel that makes a clicking sound when it spins. And what we do is you get a prize whether you get the question right or wrong, because learning's the real reward. But this is where we share out a lot of our norms data about substance use. I like doing this at one of our events at New Student Orientation, because it gives me a lot of feedback on what they know. So the year Minnesota legalized adult use cannabis, one of the questions was, now that Minnesota's legalized adult use cannabis, you can use it on campus. Our incoming students were 100% in getting it correct, that it was not, you cannot use it on campus. And they cited their online education training. So that's a great piece of feedback for me. The other really interesting thing is we had a question on there about the average number of drinks that a McAllister student had the last time they drank. And our incoming students were all guessing a lower number than what reality was. And that was an interesting shift, that over the course of years, high school students are drinking less, and they just had an assumption that college students were drinking less than they really were. So we actually started choosing different norms data so we weren't accidentally norming like, no, students at McAllister are drinking more than you thought. So I thought that was interesting. Our snack size is sharing within other sessions, other formats and meetings. Usually, like if our student affairs division says, hey, Jen, can your team do something for 20 minutes? I will almost always do a pub quiz because we have some of this data in pieces. It's a way to get it out, but also when people confer in a pub quiz format and come up with an answer, when they learn they are wrong, that's a big learning moment because then we debrief. Why might you think that 50% of our students self-report cannabis use, right? And we might unpack our own social norms misperceptions. And then workshops, presentation reports are a meal. So we might think when we're invited into a data science class or when our Center for Teaching and Learning asks us to do something, that's meal size. But I think this has helped me be more strategic, that not everything has to be a formal presentation. And actually on our campus, a combination of bite snacks and meals is what's effective. I want to remind folks, your colleague are our key audience as well. And what was fascinating at the same orientation session, it was right, like their wellness break, so they could go around and do a lot of things. We had our wheel of norms on a table on campus. Is a lot of our staff stopped by because they were interested in the wheel, and only half of them got the question right about cannabis's legality on our campus. And so just a great reminder, when we're collecting this data, we're often using it for our own prevention efforts with students as an audience. Sometimes we're using it in a report to try to manage up, to keep our resources or gain more resources from senior leadership. And sometimes it's educating our colleagues, right? Our colleagues might have come up through residence life or another way where they had experiencing managing students around alcohol and cannabis, but maybe not trained in educators the way that people watching this recording might be. So I'd like to wind it down here. If there are any questions or thoughts, I'm always available for people to contact. So I would welcome that if you have follow-up questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that information and always giving your perspective. I like hearing the examples and just the practicality of it. You know, it's more conversational, and just being able to have these more open thoughts when it comes to prevention that, like you said, cannabis prevention is suicide prevention or suicide prevention is you know, it all goes hand in
All
hand.
related.
Mm-hmm. All right. Turn that on.